I want to welcome everyone to the legal side of cybersecurity. Today, we're going to be talking about how MSPs and integrators can protect themselves. A lot of you probably know me. I'm Shanna Odgaard, the success manager here at Defendify, the award-winning all-in-one cybersecurity platform. And I'll be leading today's discussion in a nice turn of events. And we also have our co-founder, Rob Simopoulos, who is on the call today. And he is going to be running our poll questions and monitoring for the chat and any questions that come in today. Rob, how does it feel to be taking over my usual role as Vanna?
Well, I'm really excited about it. I really hope that people ask a lot of questions so I can keep busy.
So we are pretty excited about this one. So today we are joined by Sid Bose. And Sid, prior to becoming an attorney, you actually have a very interesting background. And just so everyone knows, Sid is an attorney who specializes in the intersection of technology and law. He's part of Ice Miller's data security and privacy practice and works with a lot of clients on data security, privacy, compliance matters. So Sid, tell me a little bit about your background before law school.
Well, good. Well, thank you guys first for having me. It's always a pleasure to chat with you guys. These are always fun sessions for me. And I'm looking at that slides. I didn't see this beforehand. It reminds me of back in the day when I first joined the firm and I was still, young and ambitious, and I didn't have a whole bunch of gray hair in my, head going on. So, but yeah, prior to becoming an attorney, I spent almost 9 years in IT. I was doing various IT roles, mostly sysadmin, performance engineering. And so sort of cut my teeth as a traditional IT and engineer on that first. And then a couple of years later, I decided to go to the other dark side and become a lawyer. And so I went to law school, and here I am right now focusing on a lot of the intersection of where cybersecurity, technology, and IT sort of intersect with law. And it's an evolving sphere. It's kind of an interesting space right now just because of all the things that are moving. And so it's a fun space to be in, that's for sure. So as I'm sure everybody on the call can appreciate as well.
Absolutely. And as one of Defendify's success managers, I work with a very wide network of different types of partners, different types of companies. For traditional IT managed service providers, they have their usual help desk services, but now we're starting to see that they're managing clients' firewalls, they're providing these antivirus solutions. So if we were to ask them if they would consider themselves to be cybersecurity providers, they'd probably say no, but in my opinion, they are. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great question, and I have a feeling that there's a lot of gray in this area. Traditionally, with a lot of my managed IT clients and clients who provide service to other customers, oftentimes there's significant overlap, from your traditional IT job as well as a cybersecurity role. So oftentimes there's sometimes an expectation, if you will, from customers that because you handle my IT, you also handle my cybersecurity. Because you're the guy that I call for all of my computer issues, I'm assuming I'm also going to be calling you for all my data breach and all my cybersecurity issues. So there's a lot of an expectation, if you will, in some cases where clients who are not, especially that are not technically savvy, who are not IT savvy, start to have that expectation from their IT providers that those IT providers are in fact their cybersecurity providers as well. And sometimes that's not the same position that the IT providers take.
Which is really interesting too, because if you look at an enterprise organization, their day-to-day IT needs are met by one team, and their security and privacy is typically a completely separate sector of the organization. But we see it's a lot different in the small business world.
Absolutely. That's common that this is a traditional model, right? You have your day-to-day operational IT folks, and then you have your cybersecurity function that's usually a different group. There obviously is going to be a lot of overlap. You have your network admins that will also help on the cybersecurity side, but traditionally speaking, that those are very much deliberate and distinct functions. But not so much in the managed IT space, in the managed cybersecurity space. There's a sort of a sense that those two go hand in hand, or at least some clients expect that they would.
Absolutely. And I know that can be that conversation can be very difficult for some of our partners to navigate. A lot of them will face questions from their clients, like you mentioned. I thought you were already doing all of this stuff for me. You handle all of my IT stuff. How can our partners distinguish between their managed IT services that they're already providing and additional cybersecurity services that they're layering in? Or is there even a difference?
I think there is a difference, and I think one of the common themes you'll start to hear me say is making sure you set expectations correctly. We just had a situation where a client had a data breach, an incident in their Office 365 environment. They have a managed IT services that is responsible for administering the managed IT environment. And when we as lawyers sort of help this client with their data breach, we had a lot of cybersecurity focused questions. What are the audit trails looking like? Where did our MFA fail? But then they pointed us to the managed IT folks, and the managed IT folks as well, that's not something we ever anticipated being on the hook for or being accountable for. We were just coming in to do day-to-day administration of the Office 365 environment. So it's very important for all of my managed IT clients, and even if you're on the MSP side, to make sure you set clear expectations about roles and responsibilities. Tell your client what you can do for them, what you are going to do for them, but also tell them what you're not going to be able to support or what you're not going to be able to accomplish for them, right? It's going to have to be very clear, and you have to educate the other side. You have to educate your customers so that they also understand what the expectation is. Your roles and responsibilities need to be clearly defined, because the last thing you want to do is the last thing you want to be in is a position where your client thinks you're doing something for them when in fact you had never anticipated or you never contemplated providing that type of a service to them.
I like to think of it as their managed IT services that they're providing are keeping the technology that fuels their business just running and functional and optimal, on a day-to-day basis. So if they want to send or receive an email, if they want to retrieve a file from their server, print a document, those types of services, that's what's, access the internet. That's what's covered under the managed IT services side of things. Managed cybersecurity is keeping their data integrity intact and keeping all of that information safe and identifying what the risks are to that and how to protect against the unwanted access. So that's the way that I like to look at it. But I agree, it's really important to set that expectation with the client. You and I were talking the other day in preparation for this call, and one of the things that I had asked was, just in your opinion, what are some of the best ways that our providers can reduce their risk and their exposure?
Sure. We've talked a couple of key areas that oftentimes I see from a lawyer's perspective on where MSP, the IT provider, should be concerned, as also clients who have represented, as an attorney who's represented clients who have had issues with their IT providers. So, for example, right, from an IT provider perspective, one, protect yourself, and what that means, there's a couple of things that you can go in that direction, right? Simple things like making sure you segregate your client's data, right? You're not commingling that data. You're not, if client is entrusting you to, do a file hosting service, for example, making sure that you're not putting it all in one place. Making sure you have a great incident response plan, so you know how to handle issues, if you will. So let's say a client says something to you. Let's say a client reports to you saying, "Hey, I have this potential issue here. Do you have an incident response plan where you go about handling it properly?" Let's say you do have a high priority, or what your client thinks is a high priority issue, but do you have a ticketing process where everything by default goes to a medium level priority and then all of a sudden it gets buried? Time is of the essence in a lot of these situations. So it starts off simple things there. And as always, you can talk about agreements, having good contracts in place, right? You're always going to have to make sure that you have a piece of paper that governs your relationship. There's a lot of clients that I have, particularly the smaller to mid-size, that are always interested in making sure that they want to get to doing the work, right? So they go through, they do the negotiations, and they just want to get around to doing the work, and they don't think about actually having a piece of paper, a contract in place, right? You want to make sure you have a good contract in place that underlines each party's roles and responsibilities, the scope of work that's going to be done, what the liabilities are, how to accord responsibility. You want to have a good contract in place. And last, like we've talked about before, setting clear expectations, right? You want to make sure that you tell your client, you advise your customers, okay, what it is that you're going to be doing for them, what it is that's not going to be doing for them. Run through examples with them, right? Ask them what their issues are, what concerns them, and tell them, okay, here's what we can step in and do for you, but here's things that we're not going to do for you, right? Having those conversations, you'll find yourself that you'll make a lot more foray in with your clients and get their understanding and be in a better position to be able to support them.
That
Yeah.
also gives you a really good understanding of where their cybersecurity knowledge is based on what they view to be threats to their business and what they come up with in those types of scenarios. What were you going to say, Rob?
Got a great question on that exact topic on the agreement side. So I'm going to throw it at you, Sid. So can you recommend some type of wording that people should be putting inside of their contracts or their agreements to really define the difference between network management and cybersecurity? Is there a specific way to wordsmith that maybe?
It's a lawyer answer. Is it depends.
Okay.
So there's no easy answer there, right? So oftentimes, if you look at a traditional structure of an agreement, right, you'll have your master agreement, and then maybe you have a work order or a statement of work that goes with it that sort of delineates the nuts and bolts, the day-to-day operational activities that sort of underscores what the service provider is going to do. And I think that's where you sort of set forth what those roles are going to be, right? What that looks like. You can start off by saying, okay, you know what, I'm going to do network management functions for you, and start specifying what that is. It's setting up your network, provisioning LANs or whatever it is. And then also you can say what it does not include, right? Oftentimes that's something you don't see is, here's some things that it does not include. So network intrusion detection, I'm not going to do that, right? I'm not going to install an IPS for you. I'm not going to install a firewall for you. Or you're going to say, I'm not going to be the one responsible for maintaining your firewall rules. You can sort of delineate those work functions, if you will. And that's one easy way to go about sort of setting expectations, is to set out very clearly in that order form or statement of work, what have you, what those types of specific functions you're going to do. And you can carve out what you're not going to do. I don't see why not.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's a second question from another person who's on the webinar as well, which I think is another great one, which is, Sid, you go and you present your agreement to the customer to have them sign it. And instead they flip their agreement at you and say, hey, if you want to provide us services, you've got to agree to ours, especially, and they're mentioning here, they're seeing this in government and larger enterprise organizations they're doing business with. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something you're always going to see, and we always see, right? We, in the lawyer side, we call it the battle of the paper, right? Whose paper is it? Is it our paper or is it their paper?
Right.
And oftentimes it just comes down to negotiation leverage, to the extent, and we do see this, the larger, not just government, but larger organizations, right? The big boys of the world, they have their standard form agreement that they want to put in front of you, and they want you to negotiate within the confines of that. What I can say is, try and marry up the two to the best you can, right? You still take their paper, but you're going to have to go back in there and take a look at it and say, okay, here's where a particular provision matches up to what we have in our standard agreement. Here's another provision that the client is asking for that goes way beyond what we're willing to commit to, right? And making sure that you kind of go through those differences to sort of understand what your risk exposure is, what you're committing to, what obligations you're signing up for. And then from there, it's a decision, right? Is that something that you can meet, or is that something you cannot? Do you have the opportunity to go back to your customer and say, hey, listen, we need to revise this provision of this agreement because we just can't meet it, or it's going beyond what we're trying to commit to, or it's not the type of a commitment that we as a company can make to you as a customer. And so those are just conversations you had. And always, it comes down to leverage in these, right? Who wants it more, and what they're willing to concede and what they're willing to accept.
Great. Back to you, Shanna. That's excellent.
Obviously, with the pandemic, a lot of things have changed for many of our partners. How should remote access and the changes that have occurred in this distributed workforce, how should that be incorporated into their agreements now?
Sure. I'll give you one example that I dealt with, and this I was representing the customer on this, and they had these agreements come in from a lot of their IT providers, IT providers started saying, hey, we can't agree to some of the commitments that we've made. For example, making sure we meet SLAs, making sure we meet cybersecurity requirements. One good example was physical security, right? You might have had an agreement that specified certain controls around physical security. But with COVID hitting and the move to a remote workforce, all of a sudden you might not be able to enforce the same level of physical security because you have a workforce that's distributed across the country or across, multiple different geographic locations. And so our customers are starting to get these agreement amendments, if you will, from a lot of their IT providers saying, hey, we need to amend our agreement because we can no longer commit to these particular security requirements. And so from the IT provider side, right, one of the things you need to start considering is how has your workforce changed? What is the complexion of your workforce? How does that change? And what are the risks that go with it? Are you in a situation where all of a sudden you have a lot of customer data that is going with a lot of your workforce because now they're in disparate locations? Are you able to have business continuity because you are heavily SaaS based, right? Is all of your IT in the cloud where you can work remotely, you can support a remote workforce where it doesn't massively intrude on your day-to-day operations. Those are the important considerations. And then think about how it impacts your customer service, right? Are you going to be able to meet your SLAs? Let's say you use a ticketing system and maybe you provide first level support for a customer because of being able to have a remote workforce. Are you able to maintain those types of SLAs that you provided assurances to? If not, what do you need to do to change those? Those are just a handful of examples, but again, keep in mind that it's a dynamic situation right now, right? It's continuously changing. We've been about 9 months into COVID, a little bit more than that, and people have a good idea of what this should play out, and they're getting better and getting adept at handling these changes. But it's still a lot of change going on.
Absolutely. By the way, Rob, I meant to mention clean desk policy, not happening here. That's for sure. Thankfully,
idea.
it's just me and the dog, but it's
The dog's making a mess over there.
mess desk policy. That's what we've got going on in this.
There is another question here that I want to throw out. So this individual is mentioning that, as part of their managed services, they do provide quite a bit of, detection systems, IDSs and so forth. What's the implied liability there for them if they're managing those devices and the software surrounding that?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean, what implied liability means. So I'd like to understand that more. But if you end up in a situation where you've provided, let's take the IDS for example, right? Let's say you've committed to providing intrusion detection services. And if there is some sort of penetration into the network or something like that, and all of a sudden the client points to you and says, "Hey, I thought you had IDS in here. Why did this happen?" It all comes down to what expectations did you set, right? Did you tell the customer, okay, yeah, IDS is going to stop every bad guy from ever getting into your network? If that's what you said, and that's the expectation of the client, and that's what they're going to hold you to, chances are you might be in a bit of a trouble there, because that's something that obviously was violated here. But if you set them okay, we have an IDS, but understand that even with an IDS, it's not 100%, right? We talk about the concepts of defense in depth, educating your customer that, hey, an IDS alone is not going to prevent the bad guy from coming in. There's all these other things to do. Then you might have a better position to argue, say, yes, the IDS was vulnerable, or there was a penetration of the IDS, but understand that it's not perfect, and this is what we had set as far as an expectation goes.
Right. And having that, having that in writing as well. Which there was another question here, which we're going to get to. We're going to dive a little deeper into agreements and whether you should use templates and so forth. So we'll keep going. Go ahead, Shanna.
All right, awesome. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole here with bringing up SolarWinds, as much of it at this point is still speculation. Sure. But given that one-to-many risk that a lot of our service providers face, how important is it for security providers to have their own proper protections in place in eating the food that they cook?
I think Obviously, I'm with you. So SolarWinds is still a big black box for me. I don't know the full details of it, and I doubt we'll ever know the full details of it unless you're at very high levels. And I think it's brought into the forefront the entire concept of supply chain issues, right? We've always had to grapple with supply chain, and I think we just have to be a little bit more deliberate on managing our supply chain. So even you as IT providers or MSPs, you need to be aware of who your IT providers are and who your supply chain is, right? Your customers, chances are, what's going to happen in the future is they're going to start placing obligations on you for security and privacy and so forth. And then they're going to make sure that they're going to make you require that to flow down to your service providers and your IT providers. So you might be the middleman in this situation where your customer is all of a sudden placing obligations or requiring obligations on your part, and making sure that those requirements are also met by your downstream providers, right? So as an IT provider, as an MSP, you also want to start looking at your supply chain and making sure you start doing the right due diligence on them to understand, where your risks are, for your customers, and how that's going to play out. The nice thing I think is, not the nice thing, but I think something to have a little bit of comfort in is SolarWinds is uh, perpetrated by what we think of as nation state attackers. In all likelihood, that's not the appropriate risk for a lot of the attendees here tonight, or a lot of their companies that are here that they're representing here. And so that's a great thing. But again, there's a lot of great lessons learned around supply chain management from SolarWinds.
Absolutely. And I think one of the benefits that came out of this is it was very public. There was a lot of, news coverage around it that has prompted some conversations with our partners and their clients. And it makes it very easy to set that assume breach mentality and discuss that defense in depth strategy in putting as many protections in place as you can to prevent that. Kind of like when I leave my house every day, I lock the door. I assume that at some point there's a possibility that somebody could try to break into my house, even up here in the woods in Maine. It's possible. Do I expect that I'm going to have someone come try to rob me? No, but I take those precautions just in case. And if it does happen, I've got an insurance policy, and I can go from there. So I think it did open some doors for some good conversations with our partners and their clients. Another thing that we have talked about a few times is making sure that we have proper agreements in place. So a lot of our channel is traditional IT providers, but we also have other types of service providers like systems integrators that are moving into providing some digital security offerings in addition to their traditional physical security. Can our security providers use their existing service agreements, or should they create new ones as they're moving into some cybersecurity offerings?
That's another great question. It's something that we're constantly seeing as well. And unfortunately, as a lawyer, answer again is it depends, right? Again, I'll give you an example. We recently had a client that was a traditional IT services provider, and then they were going to expand into more of the managed security services. And one of their offerings was to be able to do penetration testing, for example. And in that situation, we looked at existing service agreements and noted that there's a lot of gaps, if you will, that would present risk, right? So for example, if you're a pen tester, a lot of you, in case you're not familiar, penetration testing, I know Rob, he's very familiar with it, and Defendify does a lot of great work in there. That you can hire a penetration tester to come in and basically perform tests on your network to see if they can get through it. Now, a penetration testing is not 100%. That means to say if the penetration tester can't find any vulnerabilities, that's not to say that there's not a vulnerability there. It's a point in time check, if you will, right? So if I do a pen test today, tomorrow something could change, and all of a sudden the day after tomorrow, you could have a vulnerability and a bad guy could get in. So those types of risks, for example, were not addressed in this IT client's existing agreements. So we had to go through and take a look at them and say, okay, what type of new business functions or what type of new services are you providing to your customers, and where those risks are and how that's covered by the existing agreements. And in the situation, in this case, for this IT client, we found out there was a lot of gaps. And so we actually had to create a separate agreement or an addendum to their existing agreement, to address these additional managed security services that they were going to move towards.
So you mean that we can't just have a business lunch that ends with a handshake and call it good?
No. If that's the end all and be all, hopefully the other side at least pays for lunch, so you can get a free lunch out of it.
And I think that you'll find this interesting as well, because I work with hundreds of different types of security providers, and a lot of them have asked us, and we even have a question here in the chat about where you would recommend finding a draft agreement as a starting point for developing one for use with clients. And a lot of our partners ask us if we have any type of boilerplate legal agreement or template that they can start working from. And they've also mentioned that there are some vendors that actually provide these types of templates for their partners. What are your thoughts on that practice?
So, I don't want this to seem like a shameless plug for an attorney, but just be careful when you sort of, go do a Google search for agreements or try to buy agreements online. What's important is to make sure that oftentimes you might not realize is when you do that, there's no attorney-client privilege that comes with it. You don't have an attorney representing, and oftentimes when you buy an agreement, for example, it doesn't really constitute legal advice. So make sure you are aware of that first. And the other thing too is you might find out that you are a special and unique business, right? You might provide something that's unique to you or how you do things. And boilerplate agreements or standard agreements are just that, right? They're supposed to be a one size fits all, or at least they're supposed to meet the bulk of the audience that they're being catered to. And you might not fit into that shoe, right? You might have special services, or you might have certain things that you do in a special way that need special contract language in there. So you can start there, but ultimately where you want to be, if you want to have really true comfort, is make sure that you get a once over by an attorney or somebody to say, okay, you know what? I understand your business. I understand what you are willing to commit to, and understand what types of risks you're willing to take. And here's an agreement that's going to fit all that and meet your requirements.
In a past life, I was a real estate paralegal, and we used to see this a lot with the wills and those types of probate documents that were prepared on some online service, and then the families had a big headache when it came to selling the property or trying to deal with anything in the probate process. So it's one of those things where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Could you be looking at a decent check to an attorney? Possibly, but it's better than saving you thousands of dollars in legal fees or headaches and reputational risk down the road. So I definitely agree. And so I will happily give the shameless plug for Sid and his services if you want some eyes on
appreciate it.
An
agreement.
agreement.
And it's like anything else, right? It's buying and selling risk, right? You put a little bit of money up front, it'll save you a lot of headache down the road. And in some situations, go ahead, Rob.
No, I was going to finish your thought there, Sid. Sorry.
I was going to say, in some situations, you might say, you know what, I just can't commit to spending time on attorney bills right now because you're such a young or startup company. And it's just a matter of managing risk. Maybe after a couple of clients, you're in a better position, then you get that reviewed. So
maybe you can convince your attorney to work out a payment plan or something.
There you go. Better call Saul.
I think the point that you made was pretty valid, though, is that if we look at, and we've looked at many different, technology providers, their offerings are so unique amongst each other. To have a boilerplate just doesn't seem like it's going to fit for all those companies. So I think that's a great point.
One of the things that we've talked about a few times is having clear expectations. And I've talked to a few partners that have gone with the approach of creating a document that the client would have to sign if they've presented cybersecurity solutions to them for a certain additional charge, and they are declining taking advantage of those additional cybersecurity services. So they create these refusal waivers, so to speak. And to me, it brings me back to a quick story from one of my past lives. One of the women that I worked with in the law office went on to open up a disc golf course, like Frisbee golf. And she used the attorneys in the firm that we worked for to craft these spectacular like waivers. And every time you play, you have to, sign off and sign in. And, there's signs about liability all over the property. And somebody that came and played multiple times a week, assigned probably hundreds of times this liability waiver, fell and broke his leg, and he still sued her. So, how do you see those refusal waivers playing into this conversation?
So as a threshold matter, disc golf is incredibly fun, so highly recommend it. But when it comes to lawsuits, nothing is ever going to really truly stop somebody from hauling you into court, right? That's just sort of the nature of the business, and the way our legal system is. Anybody can actually take you into court anytime. Where those waivers and those contracts come into play is sort of, either as a deterrent for someone hauling you into court, or once you're in court, what types of a sword and shield situation you have, right? What can you use to assert that you were in the right, or what can you use to defend yourself to say you didn't do anything wrong, right? That's where the waivers and those agreements come into place. So yes, they will help, but it's never going to stop someone from taking you into court, if especially in situations where there's a data breach or something like that.
I think the more powerful side of that as well is saying like, hey, Mr. Client, we feel so strongly about where the cyber landscape is heading with what we've seen from these cyber attackers, that these additional protections are so important, and really putting the emphasis more on like, we are really like requiring this from all of our customers. And if it's not something that you're capable of doing right now, we feel so strongly, and we're not willing to take on the risk that you have defined as being acceptable or tolerable, that we need you to sign this document, to kind of use it as a little bit of extra punch about how important it is, and also something that the MSP is living and breathing every day in that security first mindset. And I actually read a recent report, and the statistic in it was that 62% of SMBs would take legal action against their MSP in the event of a cyber attack. So even with those ironclad contracts and those waivers, it's something to think about in all of those conversations. Is like, how would this play out in a courtroom in front of a judge or a jury that probably also have that same, you providing all of my IT stuff mentality. They would probably look at it the same way. Like, well, what do you mean you didn't provide these kind of protections for your client? You're doing all of their IT needs. Wasn't there a recent case that was in the news where a managed service provider was sued by one of their clients?
Yeah, there was actually. That's a great point. So for the benefit of the folks on the call, there was a manufacturing company in the Midwest, and they had a data breach. All of a sudden, they were subject to, I believe, fund transfer fraud. So a bad guy got into the manufacturing company's email systems, started sending out bogus invoices to people in accounts payable, and all of a sudden, they had about $1 million or so go out the door. And then the clients sued their managed IT providers, saying, hey, we thought you guys would be handling all this for us, protecting us from this, protecting us from the phishing email that sort of led to the compromised credentials that gave rise to the business email compromise. So when the email account got taken over. And so the one of the things that the manufacturing company that was using to allege that the managed IT provider should have done was the managed IT provider's own website, which had made these claims about being the one-stop shop for IT needs, by covering everything IT related, and also providing assurances on the cybersecurity side. And so the manufacturing company was basically alleging that, hey, we really thought our IT guys were also our cybersecurity guys who would have been able to handle all of these issues for that. And of course, on the IT provider side, they said, oh, that's not really the position we took. The case is ongoing. I think it's ongoing, at least. I don't know how it has resolved, if it has been resolved. But again, clearly delineates, right, the need to set expectations, need to making sure that your client understands what you're providing to them, and more importantly, what you're not providing to them. Especially for clients that are not business savvy, or that not business savvy, but not IT and cybersecurity savvy. Oftentimes, everyone thinks it's all one big sort of jumble of wires, where anything computer related all funnels through one IT vendor. But you start to realize that cybersecurity and privacy have lots of nuts and bolts to it and a lot of nuances to it. You want to be careful of what your expectations you've set.
Absolutely. And the last thing that anybody would want is their name being dragged through the headlines along with that customer.
Correct.
All right.
Exactly.
So we've actually got a couple questions here coming in through the chat about assuming the breach of an MSP. That breach has been used to attack the MSP clients. Also, or even if you suspect that one of your clients has had a breach, whether it was perpetrated through you, that one-to-many situation, or if it's an adversary at the client level, a rogue employer, an insider threat, the successful phishing attempts or business email compromise, wire transfers, all the things that we've talked about earlier. What should an MSP do from a legal perspective? What should their next steps be?
Okay, great question. It's often the biggest challenge a lot of folks see. So there's a couple of different roads this goes, right? So one, from an IT and cybersecurity standpoint, cybersecurity professionals, usually their focus is, okay, how did the bad guy get in? How far did he go? And what can I do to stop him, right? Obviously, great, right? That's your fundamentals of incident response. Obviously, yes. From a legal side, well, the couple of things that we look at as lawyers and what we advise on clients is, one, what are your obligations that arise from the cyber breach? And oftentimes that sort of stems in two ways. One is you have contractual obligations, and when you have legal obligations because of law, for example. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a cyber breach where someone got into your Office 365 environment and all of a sudden they had access to every email from one of your HR employees, right? So let's say in that situation, the company who experienced that breach, they have to go through and understand what types of personal information could have been in scope, understand what those reporting obligations are. Here in the United States, for example, every state has their own data breach law. Every data breach law recites what the requirements are for reporting if you suffer a breach. So you have to go through and understand what the different types of personal information are, what type of reporting obligations it triggers. Right. Similarly, let's take the position of, let's say if you're an IT provider, right? You have a contract with your customers, and maybe that contract in there specifies, okay, if IT provider, you become aware of a data breach, you have to notify us within 24, 48, 72 hours or whatever it is. All of a sudden, you have reporting obligations that are triggered by that contract. And so as part of your incident response plan, as you're going through the cyber breach, you need to understand what those reporting obligations are. So ultimately, where it goes to is, okay, from a legal perspective, we care about the scope, right? What data was involved, if there was any data, what kind of intellectual property was involved, how much of it how much of it was taken, or what was the scope of it? What happens? Do we have any reporting obligations? Maybe it's to a business partner, maybe it's to impacted individuals, maybe it's to other companies, right? Understanding what those reporting obligations are. And then, of course, executing on those reporting obligations, right? Make sure you notify your business partner, appropriate government entities, impacted individuals. All that is in the course of your incident response, looking at it from the legal perspective.
And then, things like clients that are under HIPAA compliance, or those
Yep.
elements as well.
Exactly. Understand. So, like, that's a great point. Like, HIPAA is a great example. There's a common notion that it only applies to hospitals, but not true. It applies to anybody who handles what's called protected health information. And a law firm, for example, ourselves, we have a lot of hospital clients, but by the virtue of the work we do, we also can be subject to HIPAA, which means if we have a data breach that had PHI, for example, all of a sudden we have to understand what our HIPAA obligations are, right? So understanding what those legal obligations are is going to be very essential in handling a cyber breach.
So there's a question here that relates to an incident and the response. Let's talk a little bit about the cyber insurance side of things, Sid. First off, maybe you can touch on a little bit about the different types of cyber insurance, offerings that are in the market, because we know they're different and they're building those separately. And then how do they come into play during that incident response as well?
Sure. Cyber insurance right now is the wild, wild west, right? I think, Rob, we've talked about this plenty of times before. So everybody on the call, chances are you drive a car or maybe own a home, right? if you look at the agreement documents between your insurer and what they use, the piece of paper that they use, you'll find it across insurers a lot of times that language is the same. The reason why for that is, we've had basically 100 years of insurance disputes and a lot of cases that tell us, how a court's going to interpret a certain insurance provision and what's going to be a covered incident and what's not going to be covered, right? But switch gears over to the cyber liability landscape and cyber insurance, it's brand new still, right? Even though we're 10 years in, it's still relatively speaking brand new. And there's still a lot of unsettled law as far as, what is a covered incident, what is not covered. And so you really want to be careful of what type of paper, what insurer you're going with, right? And what you want to look for is understand what types of risks you have and what types of coverages the insurer is going to provide to you and what type of exclusions there are, right? Start there. That's your building blocks, right? So let's say, for example, you're a company that has a lot of data, a lot of personal data, right? You want to make sure that you have a lot of coverage, or you have a lot of insurance coverage for loss of data or theft of data. If you are a company that is, maybe you're in the manufacturing space, you don't worry so much as about data as you do business operations, day-to-day operations. And you might want to have coverage for loss of business or business interruption coverage, right? Because all of a sudden, you as a manufacturing plant, let's say you have a ransomware incident, all of a sudden you have to bring your manufacturing pipeline to a halt. You don't have a lot of personal data, so if you had an insurance policy to give you great coverage for personal data, it's not going to help you here, right? But if you had coverage for, let's say, business interruptions, that might be something you'll be able to invoke here. So you want to be careful is, making sure you have policies that actually cover your risks. Who you are as a company, what type of business you're in, what type of information you have, where do you find yourself, if a cyber incident does happen, where it goes. And during the course of a breach, you want to make sure that you notify your insurance carrier, right? Oftentimes, your insurance policy will specify when you have to notify your insurance carrier. Some of them require you to notify them within X number of days of discovering an incident. Some of them will give you 30 days. Reason why that's important is if you don't provide that necessary notice, some of your claims could be denied. So those are the couple of things to keep in mind as you're going through a cyber breach is, hey, do I have insurance? Do I have to provide a notice to my carrier? Make sure you act on those requirements right away.
I think it's also important too. It reminds me of my childhood with having a father that was a fire chief, and there were many times that we would, be going to play mini golf, and then all of a sudden the scanner would go off and we're going to a fire instead. And having a curious mind, I used to always ask my dad, like, what happened and how did the fire start and things like that. And he used to always say, my job is just to put the fire out. When everything's kind of smoldering, then we call in the people that are experts in the forensic side of things and figuring out, where that fire started, how it spread. He's like, that's my job is just to put the fire out. We let the other experts come in and figure those things out. I think that also translates to the managed service provider side of things and getting the client's cyber insurance provider and their attorney and those other important people that should be involved in that incident response process involved as quickly as possible. Because a lot of the times those cyber insurance providers want to send their own teams in for the investigation side of things, right? Is there any liability if the MSP starts to try to investigate what occurred, or what's the legal side of that?
So great point, and it can go. There's a lot of to this. So one of the things that you want to make sure is you have your insurance. In some insurance companies, what they'll say is, we want to have you hire a particular insurance provider, not insurance provider, a particular security firm to be able to do the forensics, right? So the investigator that you bring in to be able to do the work. Sometimes, depending on the insurance company you have, they might say, we're going to have a short list of approved investigators, and those approved investigators are the only ones you can pick from. But let's say you happen to have been working with Defendify, right? They know your environment, they know your people, you have a good working relationship. When you're going through and procuring your insurance, what you want to do is have some sort of provision in there that would allow you to hire Defendify to be able to do that same work for you, right? Oftentimes, a lot of clients find benefit in this because they don't have to onboard a completely new IT company to be able to say, okay, here's the environment and so forth, because that can oftentimes take time and it's not always efficient. But you might have Defendify that you've been working with so far, and you have a great working relationship, and it would just be a seamless transition for them to be able to do this sort of forensics work, that's great. You want to make sure that your insurance coverage is included there. Because what happens if it's not is, let's say, you use your IT provider, but it's not an insurance IT provider. When you go back to your insurance company, what's going to happen is they're going to deny your claim, or they're going to deny any charges with respect to that particular type of work. So you might end up in a situation where you have, $100,000 bill for forensics, but because your forensics, the consultant or the company that you used for that forensics was not insurance approved, you're going to pay that out of pocket.
It's crazy. We get a lot of questions about cybersecurity insurance. If that's a topic that you as partners would like to see another session on, please shoot us an email or let us know in the comments and Q&A. And we've got one more thing. We're going to open it up to any more questions from our partners here. So if you guys have any questions, you can type it in the Q&A or into the chat function. I've got one that comes up a lot in some of our partner conversations and demos. A lot of organizations nowadays think that they have security covered because they've predominantly switching over to cloud applications. What are some of the legal considerations around cloud security?
Well, I would say think of cloud as just any other piece of technology that's coming on board, right? The risks that you would have seen, 10 years ago with any new technology are the same ways you would look at the risks when it comes to cloud. All right, think about what data it is. One of the things that I always often see is, you think you're the cloud provider, but all of a sudden you find out your data is not in the United States. It's being hosted on a server in another country. What are those risks for you? Did you make representations to your client, for example, that you would only you will host data here in the United States? If you did, and all of a sudden you have a cloud provider that doesn't have that same sort of controls, you might be in violation, right? The data is one of the things that the biggest thing that I look for. And the other thing is like business continuity, right? Sometimes we had a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine, he was working on a bankruptcy case with a cloud provider. The cloud provider went bankrupt, and all of a sudden the data center was shut down. And our client, the one that we were representing, had data on those servers that they needed. So, my colleague was trying to negotiate to have someone, turn on literally flip on the lights just for a few hours to boot up the servers to be able to pull that data off. And so, just because it's on the cloud doesn't mean it's completely safe. There's just new risks to be thinking about and making sure you go through those and acknowledge those.
I heard a great analogy once where somebody said that relying solely on your cloud provider for security solutions is like living in an apartment building in a really, really bad area and not locking your apartment door because the complex door was locked. I was like, that's
exactly. That's a great point. Oftentimes, one of the things that I notice in these negotiations when I help clients get in cloud services is we'll have my client who's trying to procure SaaS services, for example. The SaaS provider says, well, yeah, we're on AWS or we're on Google Cloud. And we ask the SaaS provider, what does your security program look like? What does your information security program look like? And oftentimes the answer is, oh, it's on AWS, it's fine. And as all of you know, it's not just important, right? You can buy a lock, but if you don't use it, right, it's going to be of no good, right? So oftentimes our SaaS providers seem to think that, okay, yes, just because I'm on AWS, I'm safe and good. But if you actually haven't configured and deployed correctly, you'll still have vulnerabilities. And so what I try to let my clients know is just because it's a SaaS provider or just because it's in the cloud, understand that here's the types of risks that come with it. And you have to make sure you account for those as well.
I heard a horror story about a cyber insurance claim being denied because of configuration issues on behalf of the claimant, and that was what caused their claim to be denied. So
exactly,
very, very interesting. I don't
have any other questions, so why don't we tell everyone how they can reach Sid? How's that sound?
Yeah, I got one more that I just want to touch on really quickly here, because I know we've got a lot of systems integrator partners. And Sid, one of the things that I saw in your bio information is that you're a part of the NTIA working group on IoT security. And obviously all the interconnected devices nowadays are only increasing in numbers. I bet if I said, hey, Alexa, to a lot of people, everybody's backgrounds would be freaking out right now. So with the amount of physical security providers that we have that are installing these IP-based devices, there's always like a security conundrum here. Like the folks at the IT company or the client company might view that as the responsibility of the person who installed it, whereas the integrator might say it's the responsibility of the people who manage the network. What are your thoughts on that, accountability for security in IoT devices?
Great question. And we actually had I think Rob, maybe we presented together on this a couple of years ago too, is, if you're in the position of an integrator, and you are installing hardware that's manufactured by another vendor for a customer, right? Again, setting expectations, right? Understanding that what you're bringing to the table, right? You got to make it clear that, okay, as the installer, here's my responsibilities and this is the scope of what I can do for you, right? Outside of that, you have to realize you have to go back to the vendor, or we're both at the mercy of the vendor or that manufacturer of that device to be able to say, okay, here's what I can do for you. I think a couple of years ago, we had a great situation where we had a manufacturer that was selling hubs, interconnected hubs, and the integrator was responsible for installing them. The integrator found out that, a very simple thing, the default user ID and password could not be changed, right? The customer, they had a great information security program, and as part of their information security program, they had a rule that says all default user IDs and passwords must be changed. And the integrator was in a position where they could not change that because that was locked down by the manufacturer, right? In that situation, the manufacturer was the one that controlled these devices and was not able to, did not afford the integrator or the customer to be able to change the default user IDs and passwords. In that situation, it's the integrator really can't do anything. And that's at that point, they have to set that expectation with the customer saying, I can only do so much for you. Outside of that, you have to look to the vendor, the manufacturer to be able to give you additional things. And with IoT devices, it's becoming even more pervasive. You start to realize the proliferation of IoT devices and just the sheer fragmentation of the different types of IoT devices there. It can really make an integrator's head spin trying to keep track of all these different devices. And they just have to make sure that, they set expectations for their customer, saying that these are not being manufactured by us. We're just the installers or so forth. And this is what we do. This is what we're not going to be responsible for. And anything beyond that, it's between you and the manufacturer.
Yeah, piggybacking on that, what you just said, Sid, which is great stuff, is also being very clear, in my opinion, with the customer that, many of those devices are going to need updates and patches at some point in time. I see too often projects being done where they deploy them on a construction project and they just walk away without having the conversation about, vulnerabilities that may occur on these devices. And I think on top of all that, working closely with, there's some great manufacturers who are making equipment today who will provide you cyber hardening guides. So they'll teach your technicians how to deploy them appropriately and set things up. So taking advantage of that as well.
Those are the kind of vendors you should be trying to work with, not the ones that say, yo, you can't change the default password.
Yeah, you can't change.
Terrifying.
And funny you mentioned that, Rob. Like patching is one of the biggest concerns with the NTIA. One of the big things we're grappling with is IoT devices. They're so prolific, but there's such a low cost. There's a big question of whether or not some vendors even have a plan to maintain or support them right down the road. You'll find out an IoT device has support for a handful of months, let alone a few years. And so if you're the integrator that's deploying the solution there, there's a lot of risks for you if the vendor comes back, if your customer comes back and says, hey, all of a sudden I can't have updates or there's these vulnerabilities here and you're not going to fix them. You want to be careful on what that looks like.
Yeah, so that's how we reach you, Sid. What's the best way to get you?
You can email me, sid.bose@icemiller.com, or you can just call me. But if you go to my website, you can find my information there. And then would love to chat with anybody if you have any questions. But yeah, thank you guys for having me. This has been a lot of fun. It's always a good time.
Thank you for answering all of our burning legal questions. We can all go back to pretending that we are not attorneys and don't play them on TV. So
yeah, right. Another reason to keep hating lawyers. So
I used to
Thanks.
work for a bunch of them. They were fantastic resources to have anytime you needed, like, you know,
See, we're
something
not
written
so
on
bad,
company
right?
letterhead. I
Sid,
got a
you're a
security
special
deposit
one.
back like that one time. All it takes is a little letterhead.
There you
Sid,
go.
great seeing you. Always blessed.
Thank you both. Appreciate the time. Thank you guys, everyone, for attending.
Thank
Bye,
you, Sid.
Shanna.
Thank you for everyone for joining us.
See you
Bye,
guys
Rob.
later.
See you soon.
Bye, Shanna. Bye, Rob.
Bye.
Bye.